Okay, here we go. Welcome everyone. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to join us as we will hand this over shortly to VantagePoint Sports Consulting, who helped us through this process, which albeit efficiently took about 6 months to kind of work through, and a lot of really detailed work went into this, of which many of you participated in the survey, but there were interviews and background research, all of which Swap and Scott will not Scott, then Marco will take us through shortly. We expect the session to take 20 to 30 minutes to work through, and hopefully you guys will enjoy the presentation. And we have a final slide that has information on contact information if there's anyone that you'd like to follow up with afterwards. But if nothing else, I'll pass it over to Swap to kick things off here.
Perfect. And Marco, I just want to make sure you're up and running.
All good.
All good. Perfectly. Okay. Awesome. So we've got the screen up. I hope everyone can see that. Thank you, Chris and John, again for the time. We're going to walk you through the findings of our officiating pathways optimization project that took about 6 months from start to finish, starting at the end of 2024 and culminating in a final recommendations package in June, which we are now presenting, of course, to all of you today. Just a quick overview of the project. I know many of you have been participating in either the survey or interviews or have heard of this project, but ultimately our goal was to review and generate recommendations to optimize the officiating pathways and experience in athletics in Canada. Why? Well, officiating is essential to the integrity and success of any sport, but even more so in athletics. We have more than 1,000 officials across Canada, and that number has remained relatively stagnant despite the growth in the membership and number of events being run. We recognize that current officiating pathways lacked clarity and transparency, and we had a primary objective to increase the number of officials that participated in the ecosystem while also enhancing the consistency and quality of their experience. Our stakeholders were Athletics Canada, the provincial branches, and of course all of the members of the officiating ecosystem, including officials across Canada. And we did this project over a course of kind of 3 phases. The stakeholder survey, which many of you were a part of, launched in January 2025. We got results from that and did a few deep dive interviews and focus groups with various officials of varying tenure and level in April. And then finally, we consolidated all that information into a final recommendations package in June. So let's talk about the survey. Ultimately, we ended up having 312 officials, as well as a number of other folks who were in the officiating ecosystem, i.e. members of Athletics Canada or the branches, participate in the survey. We've been doing surveys in the world of Canadian sport for many years. This is one of the highest engagements that we've seen, not just in the athletics ecosystem, but across sport overall. So that tells us that there was a lot of information to be looked at and voices to be heard. From those 312 surveys, we ended up doing focus groups and interviews with around 30 members of the officiating ecosystem to get a deeper understanding of the pain points and the areas of critical need within both the pathways and the overall officiating experience. What do these data points tell us? Well, first off, only 56% of officials were satisfied with officiating pathways as they were designed. And a lot of that dissatisfaction came from an unfamiliarity of what the officiating pathways were. Only 43% reported being familiar with officiating pathways. And almost a third of officials, at 32%, reported having difficulty accessing officiating resources. So we grounded ourselves in these numbers as the current state. And Marco's going to walk us through now a little deeper dive into what some of the major pain points that were causing these results in the officiating ecosystem.
Thanks for sharing that, Swap. So if we can move on to the next slide, before we get into the pain points we assessed through the officiating sort of landscape, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key themes that we found as we went through these evaluations. All of the questions that you had seen in the surveys, and for those of you that participated in the interviews, they came down to 2 really big things here. Why do people become officials, and why do you stay officials in your ecosystem? And the numbers don't lie that almost half of you, one of the reasons you become an official is because you want to give back to your community. What that translates to is you stay an official because you value the relationships that you build within your communities. 36% of officials in the ecosystem have a real strong personal history with the sport. And we heard that whether they had a son or daughter or a parent that was previously in the sport, or they participated in the sport themselves, it really gave them that true enjoyment, and you do love the challenge. And that's what makes you stay an official. And finally, we talk about the supporting of the athletes. 21% of folks wanted to do that. That's what really got them going. That's what gave them the fire to become an official. And 30% of you means you keep contributing because of the support and development of athletes along their pathways. So really two big key themes that stood out for us. Really important to see how the ecosystem comes together. Now, as Swap had mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we saw from the ecosystem. And when we went through our surveys and we went through our questions, a lot of this came down to about 6 key themes. And a lot of officials found that they struggled with these at some point in their pathway. The first one was a lack of mentorship and overall guidance. So whether that was the inability to find a mentor or the inability to have a clear mentorship pathway. The second was evaluation delays. We had heard some stories of evaluations taking longer than a few years, and having access to those evaluations became challenging, not just geographically, but also having the right person to conduct your evaluations. The overall lack of governance transparency. So how is the officiating ecosystem being governed, and how transparent is that to everyone across the country? Inconsistent communication came up a multitude of times, and that was from messaging, newsletters, just overall communication with the ecosystem. Recruitment and retention, we recognize, is one of the key themes that is becoming very challenging right now. Getting new members in the door, but not just getting them in the door, but how do we keep them in the officiating ecosystem? And the last one that stood out through all of our survey results and our interviews and our assessment was the modernization of resources. Oftentimes we heard about the pen and paper and the clipboard. We are now obviously moving to a more digital world where everyone participates across the country. How can we make that more accessible for them? We'll go into that a little bit more detail on the next slide. These were just the highlights of the key themes. You'll see that broken down into sort of the 4 things we talked about it. I went through the recruitment, the advancement, evaluation, retention, and governance and culture. I just spoke to all of these. So recruitment, the visibility for officiating roles we'll get into. Obviously there's an aging population, which kind of ties into recruitment and retention. We'll get a little bit into advancement and evaluation, but I wanted to show you guys all this breakdown into particular bullet points. So Swap, if you go forward, we'll kind of touch on the first one, which is now where VantagePoint stepped in a little bit further and talked about our recommendations for evaluation and advancement. Now, this slide we put up shows you the average time in Canada it takes to complete one of these professions. 4 to 6 years of education and training for a high school teacher, 4 to 7 years if you're going to be a high performance hockey ref, 10 to 12 years of education and training experience for a medical doctor. And based off our evaluation and assessment, to become a level 5 official in Canada, it's 10 to 15 plus years of education, training, and completed evaluations. So our main recommendation from this slide is that we really clarify each level in the officiating ecosystem to make sure it meets the needs of athletics in Canada. What that means from our assessment, it takes too long to become a level 5 official. You saw the graphic. It's almost 5 or 6 more years than becoming a doctor in Canada. So our recommendation is that level 1 to 5 should take approximately 5 to 7 years. Now, we're not saying you should become a level 5 official overnight. It should take time. You should have training. You should have experience. You should have exposure to the ecosystem. But we believe the sweet spot is about 5 to 7 years total. Our last recommendation when we touch on evaluation and retention for this particular point is we think that every evaluation should be completed within 12 months of having all your criteria met at that level. So if you have completed all of your criteria to go from 2 to 3, you should be designated an evaluation within 12 months of that time. Now, moving forward, Swap, if you don't mind, we'll talk a little bit more on the retention when it comes to meets and how we fix this from an evaluation standpoint. It's a concrete solution. We want to set minimum officiating standards for event sanctioning. Fairly simple concept. If you want your meet to be sanctioned or ranked, you need qualified officials. You can see there that local meets will need level 1 officials with level 2 chiefs and so forward. This does a couple of key things pretty immediately. It creates clear career progression and incentives. It ensures that meet quality has standards, and it gives officials a reason to want to advance through the pathway as they can move through sanctioned events. Right now, this framework ties sanctioning to officiating standards. We want it to make sure we can create demand for high-level officials while we also protect the integrity of each competition and each type of meet. Another recommendation of our swap, if you pop over to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about standardized events. So these are our recommendations for event guidelines with very, I don't want to use the word strict, but standardized working conditions. So you see there from our assessment, we picked out a couple of key things we think should be standard for all events across Canada. Shift time should be no longer than 8 hours per official each day. Each shift should have a minimum of 2 15-minute breaks and 1 lunch. We understand that championships may be an exception. Mandatory shelter for all anticipated weather. It's been very hot here in southeastern Ontario over the last couple of days, so that should include sun, rain, wind, humidity. Hydration and food should be readily available at all times, regardless. That includes snacks that are nutritious, energizing, also accommodating dietary and allergy concerns, but largely that means readily available water at every single event. Travel within reason should be covered safely. And we heard this from a lot of folks in the ecosystem, but officials should be provided 1 standard uniform per year to officiate events regardless of level. And the tidbit on the side there, you can see that events that do not meet these minimum requirements will not have their results recognized by Athletics Canada. So those are a couple of the recommendations around evaluation and retention, and Swap's going to take it from here to walk you through the governance and culture portions.
Yeah, so the last of our major recommendations was really around implementing clear and transparent governing principles for the officiating ecosystem and the governance body of NOC. The goal with these initiatives or these sub-initiatives were really to drive transparency, fairness, and effectiveness across the ecosystem. So we start with a defined mandate and target customer. Athletics Canada should be able to clearly state and document what NOC's mandate is meant to be, who they are meant to serve, and ensure that the members of the officiating ecosystem are aware of these principles. NOC should have clearly defined roles that members will serve as during their term. Role assignment should be up to the chair, and the chair should be elected by NOC members. NOC should also clearly have stated accountable objectives which ladder up to the NOC mandate. The objectives should be the mechanism that Athletics Canada uses to hold NOC accountable to, but also for the entire officiating ecosystem to understand what NOC is doing and where they are moving the officiating body towards. Finally, term limits. NOC members and chairs should have term limits and term renewal limits as defined for Athletics Canada board members in the bylaws. Now, again, the goal of all of this is really to drive a culture of transparency, fairness, and effectiveness. We believe that with making these changes, we'll see incremental improvements, not just in the performance of NOC and the benefits that the officiating ecosystem receives, but also the ability for officials to understand what NOC and Athletics Canada are doing and how that performance is being reflected in the results. Now, the recommendations that we walked you through are not the only recommendations that we've made to Athletics Canada. What we see here is actually the laundry list of other recommendations that we have put forth for Athletics Canada to consider to drive improvements across the various stages of the officiating ecosystem. This entire list has been provided to Athletics Canada. However, we do believe that the key recommendations we outlined today are of largest priority to be implemented. Steps undertaken. So what we have seen is Athletics Canada taken several key steps in response to this. Of course, today we're hosting the National Town Hall, the ability for us to provide our findings directly to you all, the officials, a community feedback loop so that feedback can be taken further. And I will display a slide showing contact information for individuals to provide direct feedback towards. A dedicated working group within Athletics Canada has been created to review these recommendations in detail. Now, to date, this group has assessed and analyzed all recommendations and prioritized which areas of focus will be looked at first, as well as identified initial opportunities for implementation across the officiating ecosystem. This working group will be meeting monthly with provincial and territorial branches to share updates, gather feedback, and keep momentum going. Ultimately, the hope is that these recommendations are not just seen as a one-time recommendation, but rather to catalyze the work that needs to be done to actually have these recommendations implemented. We talked about next steps, working group to commence refinement and prioritization of recommendations with implementation plans as well to be developed. And the goal is to have these recommendations, the prioritized recommendations, ready for launch by end of year 2025. Now, we just want to note that some of these recommendations will take longer than that to be implemented just by the nature of what they are. However, we do expect the plan to be developed and released again by the end of the year 2025. Before I move on to that last slide, I just wanted to open it up to Chris if there was any other points you wanted to make on these next steps.
No, I think you covered it off there, and we're wanting to move quickly on this, but intelligently, and that we feel like we've got a good working group that has representation from across the country to help support us in this implementation. But really, I mean, the opportunity here is to thank both Marco and Swap. I mean, this was a short overview of the work that they did over the last 6 months, which was very detailed, and I feel like we've got a really strong set of recommendations that will lead our officiating ecosystem to a much better place, both in the near term, but I think it'll be more sustainable over time. So excited about that, excited about the work we have ahead to deliver that. But also really big thanks to all the officials that took part in that survey and that are attending today. It obviously shows how invested our officials are to take that time to do that, and we expect that to continue. And if there's opportunity for feedback, please ensure that you share those points when you can. Probably it from me, Swap.
Perfect. And just to follow up on that last point, we wanted to provide just the contact information for the various stakeholders of the branches, as well as John from Athletics Canada. Encourage that if there's direct feedback, to provide feedback to either your branch representative listed here or to John, so that way that information can be collected and incorporated in the process. I believe that's all we have for today. So I did want to spend kind of the last minute here just thanking all of you in the officiating ecosystem. For Mark and I, it was a pleasure to work and to get detailed and to meet many of you and learn more about what it is that is really the pain points of the process and how things can improve. So thank you all. It was really a fun project for us and a rewarding project for us to work on. Chris, I'll hand it back to you to close things off.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So this session has been recorded. We will also translate that deck, and we'll have that circulated through the officiating newsletter in the coming days. But otherwise, thanks everyone for taking time out of your day, and look forward to working with you all soon.